In a time where life was simpler, love was closer, and the world felt as though it stood still, Elizabeth Kavanagh was born in Daly to Archibald and Jessie Kavanagh. The family life of the 1920s in Fairlie, Ayrshire, Scotland, was very strongly motivated by love, care, and family, but very strict values. The world whirled into chaos in 1939 when World War II cast its dark shadow. Elizabeth, one of 7 Kavanagh children who had to work from the age of 14 as a cleaner at the village doctor's surgery, found herself working for the Navy anti-submarine establishment on the Clyde. While at the anti-submarine establishment, she learnt to drive, but this was quite unusual because women didn't drive at that time. She and her brother-in-law, David, shared a car. From 1942 until 1965, Betty drove without a license. Once, when Betty and David were taking a short drive, an officer in a police commissioner's uniform pulled them over. David urged Betty to remain silent and let him speak. As the officer reached the car, Betty rolled down the window. He leant in and asked for directions to the local police function in Logs. About 20 years later, while they joked about this, David apparently smiled cheekily. "Betty, there's something you don't know about that. I didn't have a license either." Betty was considered quite beautiful in her village, and she was likened to Hollywood star Bette Davis. As a regular churchgoer, her faith took on a new dimension in 1940 in a church in Largs, when Betty, at the age of 19, met Harry Hill, a handsome English naval engineer who had seen her at Mass and attended every Mass the following weeks to catch a glimpse of her. They spent little time together during their courtship while he fought overseas in Africa and Egypt, but they corresponded regularly. Their letters were slow and censored, as all mail passing through official routes was. Harry wrote letters and poetry to his Scottish lassie, and 4 years later, at the age of 23, she married her church love. Her strict father predicted she'd end up on a pig farm in Ireland by marrying Sassenach, Englishman. Thankfully, he was wrong. When asked if she remembered the day World War II began, she said, "I was on the train and a porter called out that the war was declared." Since the wedding was during the war, the ceremony was small and yet beautiful and perfect. After 2 years, Harry left the Navy. Another year followed and Betty and Harry moved to London for a new adventure. After the hysteria of war ended, they found that surviving World War II equipped them with courage to face uncertainty, and like many of the generation, they wanted to live their lives fully since they knew what their freedom had cost. Their first child, Michael, was born in 1947 into post-war London. 5 more children followed: Trish in 1949, Laurie in 1950, Paul in 1954, Claire in 1956, and finally Juliet, the youngest, and 9 years later, in 1965, when Betty was 45. Her own mother, Jessie, was a tailor and taught her how to sew her own clothes. She made all of her children's clothes, often cutting garments down to fit. Having 2 young children and 3 older ones in the 1950s proved rather difficult. After the war, rationing was still in place and the economy was struggling to recover. Everything from milk and eggs to stockings and blankets was scarce, and what people had taken for granted became a rare necessity. Betty remembers how feeding her family was difficult, and so she made soups that were all full of grains and lentils, Scotch broth, stews with little meat, Yorkshire puddings and gravy, bread and dripping. The church was still very important to Betty. It played a big role in the life of her family. She started a League of Catholic Mothers in her home parish of Our Lady of Dolores in Hendon, and was central to many projects which helped the underprivileged and old. Social justice and outreach, although in some ways more subtle than it is today, was a characteristic of the post-World War period for many people, and particularly the Hill family. Their door was always open to those in need, and priests from South America visited often, seeking a meal and a bed as they tried to learn English. Betty juggled the family responsibilities with choir, bookkeeping for the church, and regular visits to parishioners. She is still in contact with a number of people, like Sister Anthony, who taught many of the Hill children, and John Brooks, husband to a close friend. When Juliet was a young child, the family moved from 10 Layfield Crescent to 16 Sturgis Avenue. Harry had an allotment where he grew vegetables to help feed his large family. Betty was a housewife rearing children and did not work for 19 years. Married women were not encouraged into the workforce, despite having proven themselves during World War II, where they did jobs normally done by men. When she did finally go back, it was under the proviso that it did not interfere with the running of the home. Hers was a traditional marriage where her husband generally made the rules. 11 years after their youngest was born, Harry died of cancer. Her beloved mother, Jessie, died a few months after. Some fond memories of Juliet's are her father telling wonderful stories, chatting as they walked to Mass on Sunday evenings. Harry played the harmonica, and bringing a cup of tea every morning to wake she and her brothers and sister, a practice she had since adopted. 5 years later, in 1981, after 4 out of the 6 children had moved to Australia, Betty, at 60, and Juliet, at 16, moved to Australia too, unfortunately leaving her eldest daughter, Patricia, and granddaughter, Anna, behind. Having already known what it is like to leave loved ones behind when she moved from Fairlie, her small village, to London, she drew on all her courage and skills to make a new life in a new country. Australia, particularly Brisbane, has changed a lot according to Betty. The slower pace of life has been replaced by busyness, but people are still really friendly and the weather is still wonderful. She now enjoys her children and grandchildren and celebrates all that life brings her. Elizabeth Kavanagh will turn 90 on October 21st, 2011, having lived a life that has spanned across 2 centuries. She has seen war, rationing, hardship and joy. Women win the right to work, and has taught her children and 11 grandchildren to grab every moment bravely. Elizabeth Kavanagh Hill, this is your life.